The Saudi Maritime Congress is back for its strongest year yet. Register now for this two-day event taking place this September from 20th to 21st at Dhahran Expo in Dammam, Saudi Arabia. The Congress will feature a packed agenda of keynote speakers, panel discussions and networking opportunities with prominent figures in the field. Register now at www.saudimaritimecongress.com and be part of the leading event in the region.
Welcome to the Seatrade Maritime Podcast. You're listening to Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News. In today's episode, we are going to be focusing on ESG and how that relates to the salvage sector. In some ways, ESG would seem very much a part of salvage as it involves protecting the environment in a marine casualty, but there are other areas of concern. Joining us today to give us an insight into this topic is Gina Panayiotou, ESG Manager for West of England P&I Club. Listeners may be familiar with Gina from a previous episode of the podcast, where she talked about empowering young women in maritime. The focus of today's conversation will be rather different and give a preview to some of the areas that will be covered at the Seatrade Maritime Salvage and Wreck Conference in London this December. Gina, welcome back to the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Marcus. I'm very excited about this conversation, especially.
Great.
So, can't wait.
It's a really interesting topic and not something that I think I've seen too much delved into, so I'm really looking forward to getting your insights on what you can tell our listeners about this. ESG, is very much a topic at the top of the boardroom agenda today, but how does it apply to the salvage sector? As I mentioned in the intro there, is it not a sector that by its very nature protects the environment with spill containment, prevention, wreck removal, and so forth?
Exactly. I mean, in its nature, salvage and salvage operations do protect the environment. But I think I'm going to start with an interesting case which kind of highlights why ESG is so important to the salvage operations. So you've probably seen, or if the audience hasn't, I will give some details, that we had a new ship owner on the block this year, which was the United Nations. And they technically essentially became the ship owner of the FSO Safer, right, which is a vessel which is alongside Yemen since 2015. It's a floating oil storage and it's holding more than 1.14 million barrels of oil, right? Due to the war, of course, this has been left there. It hasn't been maintained to 2015. And this year, we actually saw the UN Environment Programme step in to take ownership, I guess, of this offloading operation. And we had Greenpeace describe it, of course, as a ticking bomb. So one of the main reasons that happened, if I'm simplifying it, it is because of ESG factors, right? You've got a huge environmental impact if something does go wrong and this ticking bomb does explode at some point. The disaster could be irrevocable for the ocean health, given the sensitivities of the area being in the right sea, and it could affect, almost up to 12 million people, their livelihoods and their lives. And the UN program, if you also go on the website, they talk about how 50% of that population is women and girls that will be affected. They also talk about how they plan to include in this contingency plan young people, the communities, and make them a part of that. So I think all of those elements highlight how ESG is very important to the salvage sector. It is by default related to the environment, but the duty does extend way beyond to matters like local communities, sensitive areas, so touching upon things like social and governance issues also.
It's fascinating that it involves that FSO Safer, which has had global headlines, and as you say, and sort of Greenpeace and so forth. Is there a bit more you can explain about how ESG will apply more specifically to that operation?
Well, I think the whole purpose that's driving this are technically ESG criteria, even though it may not be titled as ESG, right? Because one of the main things that's trying to be done there with all of the plans being put in place for the offloading operation, and obviously I can't go too much into the technical details because I'm not an expert on the operation, but the consideration there is to avoid any oil spill that could happen, to obviously avoid any big disaster that could happen from an explosion. a big part of it, as I said. So this could really have a disastrous environmental threat. The spill anytime could go, along the Yemen's Red Sea coastline to as far as the Gulf of Aden. As I mentioned, it affects 12 million people. That's what approximately the estimate is of local communities. So you've got the environmental aspect, which is one, obviously, keeping the oil out of the ocean, avoiding any explosions, but also ocean health and the safety there. It's a unique environment in the Red Sea. The damage could be irrevocable, or it could take at least 25 years to start restoring itself. Then you've got the community element. Obviously, it's a zone that is suffering already, where the location of this vessel is. So there's emphasis there on the social element of the communities, the women, the youth in the area, and getting them involved in this process. And then the governance, touching upon slightly on the governance issue, where, of course, nobody could do anything about the vessel due to the situation, the political situation and tensions. So the UN had to step in and take ownership of this project. So I think in that respect, that are all the ESG considerations that have been factored in this process.
Yeah, there's actually an awful lot of different factors there. The governance, and as you say, actually with a lot of salvage operations, the communities that are potentially affected and their livelihoods and so forth. Sort of taking that forward, I mean, more broadly to ESG for the salvage sector, are there standards for ESG for this sector, and is the industry aware of those standards if there are such?
Well, interestingly enough, I touched upon it a bit earlier. So ESG is a new designation, right? Technical new designation, even though it's been around for years. Yet ESG type of standards have been, a very important aspect of salvage operation. It's definitely not a new thing, and you'd be surprised to hear that we're not far on track when operating in accordance to ESG principles. And I'm positive, if you bring any claims person in from one of the IG group clubs, especially, right, to explain the considerations of a salvage operation to you from 8 years ago, even before ESG was the trend, they will tell you people safety come first, the environment, complying with international regulation, national guidance, sensitivities in the area, communities. And that's how you're expected to handle it as an IG. That's a standard you're expected to handle a salvage operation as an IG club. So my answer would be, while there's no set ESG standards as of yet, while we're talking today, and while the salvage sector may have only started to discuss ESG, as you mentioned earlier, probably last year at the Salvage and Red Conference was the first time I saw an ESG panel related to salvage. The sector is not only aware of them, but it is how, they approach these cases, whether they're branded as ESG or not. If you were to ask me, however, whether there is a need to brand it as ESG, and if there's more, we should be doing and why, the answer would be yes. Of course, we do need to put this under the ESG umbrella, which provides this opportunity and structure to become more efficient, but also become more proactive than reactive in these situations, because you're making decisions in a crisis situation that can affect all of these elements like communities, etc. The deeper we go and the more we understand, the better job we can do in managing situations, avoiding them, and have, situations which do have this huge impact on the life of people and the environment.
So as such, it's a lot of stuff that was already being done, but it's not got that sort of structured, formal process to it.
Exactly.
Now, you're coming from the background of a P&I club, and obviously that's sort of representing the ship owners and operators in this. Do they have a role to play in this as well? And, sort of the loss prevention part, so forth?
Well, if you're talking about the owners, I always say this, aren't they, already have a million tasks on their list to do? They've got quite a few challenges, but joke aside, obviously it requires effort from all stakeholders in the industry to succeed in any change process, especially, one which is so, I guess, in a way uncharted and new. So in light of this, definitely a big part to be factoring in loss prevention going forward. The risks are new challenges, they're changing. We've got new fuels, we've got technology, type of cargoes. I think we're talking about this a bit later in the discussion. But the risk factors are there, they're new, so you have to be preparing. So it's crucial for the owners to be ensuring the commercial viability of their operations, obviously, and the ESG considerations that keep shifting. Nowadays, for example, there's also a very heightened focus on reputational risks, right, relating to ESG. So we're seeing the rise of climate activism, and if we think it's too far down the line, we've got activists throwing paint at yachts. So you never know what could happen. You've got heightened, climate litigation. So these are all considerations that, of course, an owner needs to factor in. However, having said that, and coming from a P&I club, which is there to support owners, their owners and operators do have a lot to deal with. So you need that team around you and support network to be proactive and reactive when it comes to salvage and this new ESG era and understanding it. And at West, for example, there's been a lot of focus from our loss prevention team to constantly follow and devote time to provide resources for our members and the expertise possible for owners and operators to understand these uncertain issues, to prepare for what the future holds. So ESG considerations are becoming very much at the core of how we're supporting our members. So in short, yes, the owners do have a role to play, but all stakeholders also have key roles in ensuring that they understand the shifting standards, that they do exist, that they're met, that they're evolving with this rapid transformation on needs from regulators, government, stakeholders. So it is an all hands on deck kind of process.
Yeah, understood. Obviously, there are a lot of parties involved in these incidents. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned the reputational risk, because I think that's all increasingly something around casualties that companies are very aware of and conscious of. The salvage process itself often, I think, can be seen as being not particularly transparent. Is there perhaps more needed in that sense that all the different parties and particularly communities know what's happening?
Well, you're asking a specialist, so the answer would be, transparency is key to get to that end result. But sounding a bit cliche, the famous saying of, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done is kind of spot on when it comes to this, especially if we're trying to be more reactive. So my answer is yes, transparency is needed to help to accurately measure, assess where we stand, what we're doing well, what works, what doesn't, what could we be doing better. So the one thing is data transparency, which helps create those patterns. And once you've got those patterns, you can become more efficient on making decisions, especially ones that have to do with sustainability and such an important matter as the environment and people. And, with salvage operations have such a huge impact on people that you need to be working in that way. Understanding those realities can only come through transparency. It's, I guess, a bit like providing those housekeeping rules when you're in a conference or a seminar. If you've shared in advance, the exits, where they are, maybe if one is blocked during a certain period of the day, which it shouldn't, I know, but I'm just trying to illustrate the example, that increases your chances of understanding what's going to work in an emergency situation and guide people accordingly. And then the other brief element, of course, of transparency, if you're looking at it from a different perspective, is also sharing and showcasing, those best practices and why they're working, why they're important. So transparency really is key in salvage operations on both gathering data and creating those patterns, but also showcasing what is being done and how it works well and why.
So in particular, as we get sort of new vessel types, bigger vessel types, sharing information about how you tackle those sort of incidents.
Exactly. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things evolving from new fuels to new type of vessels. So it's very important to understand. The quicker we understand these patterns, the better we can strategize.
Yeah, talking about sort of new vessel types and so forth, we're seeing larger and larger container ships and so forth. And this, with it, has brought a trend towards larger casualties that also carry a higher environmental risk. For example, a bunker spill alone can involve 10,000 tons of fuel, even though that vessel is not actually a tanker, it's a container ship, for example. So how does that trend impact from an ESG perspective?
Well, I think we've discussed it also a bit earlier, and it falls back to what we were discussing on that we're experiencing an ever-changing landscape in maritime, right? New vessels, new fuels, etc. And that includes these new and bigger vessels and obviously a bigger risk and new risks. So technically, yeah, there is a risk for larger casualties. So the ESG perspective, or rather the criteria, do remain the same. What increases, I think, is that realization of how big this impact can be, the extent of damage, and kind of being aware of it. And this brings a heightened sense of duty and an increased need to kind of anticipate the extent of the risk, plan those mitigation strategies that are well thought, consult ESG experts and people who can look at it from a different perspective and understand, outside of the box. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the better we understand things, the better we can manage it. So here is probably also, where we see this heightened need for transparency that we were talking about before. The more data and information available from this new, vessel types, vessel sizes, etc., the quicker we learn, and the quicker we learn on how to deal, with such large-scale incidents and avoid them, or the potential, of course, and the ESG considerations that need to be factored in your risk mitigation strategy. It's a bit, I guess, like an algorithm for maybe a new social media platform. Obviously, the more users you have means more information, more data, more patterns being shared. So it starts to become more efficient and adjusted to the reality and the needs which this new ESG era is seeing and this new type of vessels are requiring.
Would this then also apply to the cargo side? Because we've seen actually the fire just recently on the car carrier Fremantle Highway, which was being linked to electric vehicles and the lithium-ion batteries. So would it apply to also the dangers around some of those newer cargoes like lithium-ion batteries?
Definitely. I mean, I think I might have mentioned this earlier, but this includes everything that you're dealing with. New vessel designs, new type of cargo that are being carried in the process, new technologies, new ways of working on board. So new types of cargo that fall under this environmental category are, of course, things that you need to be factored in. So I think, again, from the ESG strategy perspective, it comes down to a lot of what we discuss. It's new risks, part of an ever-changing world, and somehow the industry needs to factor them in. We're working towards, a very important cause. Being environmentally friendly is just the way forward. We've got no other option, right? So any form of change, especially, one that involves something such as protecting the environment and the new cargoes that then subsequently follow, will require adjustment, change management strategies, whether commercially or risk management. The key here is noted earlier, to have that team in place and the stakeholders who understand can support this transition. And again, if I come back to the standards of the IG group, for example, they have a very important role to play in maintaining those standards, avoiding or also mitigating the risk of carrying this cargo. So it's important, and at West, for example, supporting your members to understand the standards, developments, and new expectations of these new types of cargo or fuel or technologies, but also having a very, very solid and robust infrastructure in place to deal with these teething problems. I know it's not exactly a teething problem, and I'm not trying to downgrade it, but let's put it this way, right? If a major fire is occurring in a sensitive area as a result of this new change management process, I'm sure we want to be resting assured that people are dealing with this are capable, the resources are there, the financial security is there. You want this to be dealt at the highest standards, right? And I can't but stress, again, how important it is for mitigating and avoiding this risk, a better understanding and thinking back on their algorithm. The quickest way for us to learn and understand and process as an industry and deal with this new types of cargoes or whatever the case may be, is that transparency and feeding the algorithm with more data to understand these patterns.
So a lot of different things to deal with there, a lot of different factors. If we look ahead, what are the sort of the next steps for ESG and its application to salvage?
Well, I guess if people want to find out, they have to come to the conference in December, right? The Salvage and Rec one, where we'll be discussing this quite in depth. But I guess if I could share a teaser in a way, so what lies ahead and what we will probably see happening is a more structured approach. I do feel that's going to be happening, where the current process will fall and is separated in the 3 ESG pillars in a more focused way. We're generally seeing this increase in ESG reporting standards, not just within maritime, but globally. So things like the new EU regulation, CSRD, or for public listed companies, ESG reporting is becoming more stringent. We've got discussions on greenwashing, of course. So you need to be thinking about all of these considerations. I mentioned earlier climate activists, climate litigation. So this will consequently have an impact on how the industry wants to be talking about salvage and ESG, and a much better awareness on how to approach and improve it and be more transparent or whatever is required to factor in this element. My personal wish would be to see, in the context of transparency, more cases being showcased on why it's important, how it works, best practices. Because as I mentioned, that's that's the only way. How an ESG-led salvage operation is the only way forward to prove that we're going in the right direction. But yeah, as I mentioned, I think we will be discussing this quite in depth, and there may be more developments by December when we have the conference. So it's quite unclear to say, but I think that's my forecast on how ESG will be applying to salvage operations going forward.
As you say, there could well be some developments between now and December, and we're really looking forward to those discussions at the conference in December, the Seatrade Maritime Salvage and Wreck Conference, which will be held in London. So, Gina, I'd just like to thank you so much for taking the time to appear on the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.
Thank you very much. Again, it was a pleasure, Marcus, to be here, and always a pleasure to be part of the Seatrade community and podcasts.
Thank you. That's all we've got time for on this episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast. Thank you for listening.